Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for You are with me. Your rod and Your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. When you see the picture on our outline, it looks kind of dark, doesn't it? It's even kind of a gloomy picture, really. But we're talking about the valley of the shadow of death. And typically, if we think about that, we think in kind of negative terms, that something bad has happened or something bad's about to happen. Well, let's back up just a little bit to all the sheep analogies here that we have talked about. And we know sheep face challenges daily. Many challenges that they could not identify on their own, but that's okay when they have a good shepherd. When they have a shepherd that can help them through that. And as long as they're willing to follow the shepherd, they're never alone. Sheep are never alone when they're willing to follow the shepherd. But in a personal sense, we've all been there. In one way or another, we've confronted dark times in our life. Periods of times when we've just been under a lot of duress. There's been a great burden that's on us. We've been there. We know something about when we think of that valley of the shadow of death in that very negative, dark term. We can say that, well, I've been there. I have been in that dark place. Sometimes it's just a bad day. Some people might say, I'm in a dark valley today, and it's just a day. Whatever has happened today has not been good. It's overwhelming to them. Maybe it's something that's more significant. It's a long-term issue. It's a long-term illness or something like that. And people might say, well, I'm walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Or, where do we sometimes hear the term? Or where do we hear Psalms 23 read? Most often. At a funeral. At a funeral. I'm not saying it's inappropriate. I'm not saying it's wrong. In fact, I think it's intended to be a very comforting passage as a whole. And so that's fitting. But is that all that it's talking about? And then when we look at this term, this phrase, this verse that we're looking at tonight, the valley of the shadow of death, does that mean that's all it's talking about is death? That death is imminent or death has happened? Is that all there is to that? And I would suggest that I think there's more to the story. That there's more for us to see and to think about. David, the writer of this, knew something about walking through a dark valley. He had and faced a lot of times in his life where we read from David times when he was just depressed. That there were issues going on around him that were hard. And he knows something about being in the dark valley. But what pulled him through in those occasions is that he knew a shepherd. And that's what he's identifying in Psalm 23, is that it's like he said, I know a shepherd, I have one. And he sees God as his shepherd through life. And what we've seen as we've come to this point, and what we keep emphasizing is that we need a shepherd too. We need a shepherd that's going to be there, that's going to help us on the days that are good, and certainly to be there on the days that are bad and the days that are dark. So we have a number of things to think about tonight. Some questions hopefully posed in such a way that is just going to make us think some things through right here. Let's start with this idea. We try to think about and we picture sheep whose shepherd is leading them in search of green pastures. And in the summertime, in many places, that means going to other places, to higher ground where there's not a lot of other people, where there's not other sheep, where they can find pasture to eat through the summer. But to get to the high pastures, you have to go through valleys along the way, right? I mean, if you're working your way through the mountains, there are, of necessity, valleys along the way. Valleys aren't necessarily bad. Oh, some inherent dangers, perhaps. Because if we think in terms of a shepherd with sheep, what would be some of the dangers that the shepherd has to be aware of? Injury. And why would there be injuries in the valley?
Up and down mountains.
Up and down mountains,
Breaking a leg.
terrain, rocks, falling, falling off a cliff.
Typically, when you're in a valley, you're the most vulnerable because predators, typically are attacking from above. That's the way
Right.
warfare works. Obviously, a
Sure.
high position is better than a low position. So, walking through a valley, you have to be aware of predators.
Yeah. And if you're in a valley and predators come around you, where do you go? You're limited on being able to get away. So yeah, some concerns. Anything else about valleys? There's some negatives here for sure, right?
Storms.
What about storms?
Water runs downhill.
Water runs downhill. And that stream that is so helpful and refreshing and necessary, for the sheep, could turn into something different. It could even wash them away. Any benefits to being in a valley?
Might be cooler.
Cooler? What else?
That's where you grow
Oh.
personally, spiritually. I mean, for sheep, they get food.
Oh, you're getting way ahead of us here, Susie. We're still just talking about the sheep. What benefits would there be running the sheep through the valley?
The terrain's not as tough.
Well, it may not be as tough there. Fertile fields, maybe? Streams. So there's some positives in the valley. And yes, sometimes when we think about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, I'm not thinking of the positives here, okay? I mean, it pictures in my mind the negatives. But I would suggest there's some positives that we need to think about too, including what Susie is talking about. Sometimes our greatest growth potentials personally is when we're in the deepest valleys. And so we have to think about that. But anyway, we have this picture in our mind here of the sheep with the shepherd. And we think then about David's words. I want you to answer this. I want you to respond to this. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, focus on the part when he says, I walk through. What does that mean, or what does that imply?
He's not stuck.
He's not there.
He's gonna get through it.
Okay, going to get through it. Go with that some more. Give me some ideas. Give me some thoughts.
You don't stop, you just keep going.
You don't stop. Could you stop? Well, sure. You could. May not be the place to stop. I walk through, he says. Give me some more. Where's the points we got to draw from this? I walk through, he says.
Usually if you're in a valley and you're trying to come out, you've got to climb uphill. So it's harder to climb uphill than it is to go down. So it's easier to get in the valley. But when you're trying to, you can stay down there, but when you're trying to come out, that's where you meet some resistance.
Well, it's a lot harder to walk up than down. And it can be it can fool you sometimes. If you do much hiking in the mountains and you've hiked 2 miles on a trail that's only 5 miles and you walk 2 miles and it's mostly downhill and you think, man, this is great. This is a great hike. Now we are making really good time on this hike. But then we come back around the loop and we start working our way up. Oh, wait a minute here. Now it's changed, right? As we start working our way back up out of the valley. Okay, I walk through, he said.
It could also mean that, you don't stop, but you don't give up. You start facing challenges in life and adversities, so just don't give up, keep going.
I think this is such an important point, the idea of not giving up. Think about David. Were there some times that it seems like he was nigh upon just giving up? Guy, seems to me like there were some times he was pretty low. Rather despondent. And we get real about that. We all might say, yeah, I understand that. I've been there too. I know how that feels. We might all say that. And yet there has to be a decision, a determination that says, I'm going to get through this valley. I'm going to walk on. But if you're doing that all by yourself, it's a lot harder climb than being with someone that's saying, I think we can make it. Come on, let's keep going. We can take a break for 2 minutes, but then we got to start moving again. And how different that hike may be, right? Working our way out of the valley.
Something that comes to mind is walking through. Is it's a journey, you're heading somewhere.
Oh,
There's
okay.
a goal.
I love this, okay? God, you were walking through. It says within itself that there is a goal. It is a journey. It's a process. And there is an end goal that we're heading to. We're going to get through this. We're going to work our way on through this right here. You know, there are some challenges in valleys for sure, but that's not inherently bad. And I'm going to go back to Susie's point on this. I'm not sure any one of us would pray in our prayers daily, Lord, I want you to test me today to the point I fall on my knees. I'll be honest, I don't recall that being in my prayers recently. I'm thinking that's just not where we're coming from, right? We pray for blessings and for help and for health and for safekeeping. And I think those are pretty good things to pray for. But some days we do face some challenges, even that we've not been able to see coming. And we find ourselves in the valley. In fact, it's not too often that we really anticipate those things. There could be some occasions. You know, we have some health issues that are coming, and we know one day this is going to get bad, and then we hit that valley. Okay, I get that. That's not necessarily what I'm referring to. But the valleys, I want to talk about those valleys a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, James 1 verse 2, count it all joy. You know, if the product, I would say, in my personal experience, that you cannot gain endurance, as James talks about, without trials. You just, I mean, I'm not saying it can't happen, but
No,
every period
I
of
get
growth
it.
in my life has been the result of trial.
It's true. I believe wholeheartedly that that's true. And sometimes even it's hard to think about and hard to talk about. For some people, you start talking about some trial in life that they've been through, it becomes a very emotional issue. And I think we can say that at some point in time we've all been there. We have faced some issue of life we couldn't have anticipated, and we hit the bottom, or at least we think. We hit the bottom. We were as low as we could go. We were despondent. We were depressed. We didn't see a way out of the valley. And yet somehow we came through. We came out of the valley. And once on the other side, what might we recognize? What might we see?
How we started going into the valley.
Well, yeah. How did we get there? And it might even be one of those things where we say, well, I ain't going to do that again. You know, there's a lesson learned from that.
Jesus carries us. I think of the footprints on the sand, and when the man complains that Jesus left him, he said, no, that is when I carried you. And I think that is beautiful. And I also think maybe that's why Jesus sent them out in twos, so they would have
For
the
strength and encouragement. We think about a figure such as that as Jesus carrying us through. You know, that he'll never forsake us. You know, Scripture says that God will never forsake us. And you think about that analogy and where does it come from? Well, the very idea of shepherding again. And we've talked about in previous lessons that time, in that physical way, the shepherd that has to go out and pick up the one that is lost or the one that is maimed, the one that is tired, the one that can't get up on his own. And how the Lord may do that with us. You know, back to Tim's point, this passage in James, James chapter 1, verse 2, you know the passage. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Count it all joy. Yeah, we've all said, thank you, Lord, for this great trial I'm going through, right?
Easier said than done.
I think I've kind of failed on that part, okay? But I think that part of the idea of that is the retrospect, where we step back and we look back. You know, we've made it out of that. We've made it out of that valley, Emma, like you said. You know, you made it out of the valley, and now we're looking back at it. And we might even look back and say, man, that was hard. That was a lot harder than I ever thought it could be, or I didn't think I was going to get out. But often we would think, but I made it out. Let's be careful with that verbiage. I made it out. Who's with us? The shepherd, right? You know, if we are walking with the Lord and He is the one true that's helping us through life, then if we make it out of the valley, let's understand why and how we made it out of that valley.
He's a lamp to our feet and a light to our path.
He is. He is that light to our feet, absolutely.
In Matthew 14, the account of Jesus having Peter walk on the water to him, I think is a really good lesson for us, because we notice that the minute that he took his eye off of Jesus,
Yeah.
and I'm just looking here at verse 30, it says, when he saw that the wind was boisterous. So in other words, he took his eye off the ball there a little bit. And when he was walking on that water, all of a sudden, the focus wasn't Jesus anymore. The focus was on the boisterous wind around him. And if we will just keep our focus on Jesus, He'll get us through that. But the minute we just start to be consumed by what's going on around us and lose that focus on Jesus, then we sink.
I love that story. It is such a simple point and analogy. Children understand it well, and I think it's probably a story that we need to use more often. Back a while, a couple, 3, 4 months ago, I was having a Bible study with my grandsons. You know, they're pretty small. And we read that passage we were talking about a little bit, and I had a couple of pictures on PowerPoint that would kind of lend itself to this, you know, Peter walking on the water. And then Peter sinking. And Greer, one of my grandsons, he just turned 6, you know, I said, what happened to Peter? In a matter of fact kind of way, he said, he didn't look at Jesus, you know. And I just love that on so many levels. But it was just also the fact that here's a 6-year-old that has it figured out, that if we take our eyes off Jesus, we get messed up. You know, we fall back in the valley, and seemingly we have no way out. And we have to keep our eyes on Jesus. And I love that. I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't think about that.
I think there's an irony, at least to me, about the Lord is with us in that deep, dark valley to help us through the difficulties and the trials and so on. But then I think about Hebrews 12, and I think that He's with us to help us through and to protect us, but He may be leading us through that valley, that deep, dark valley, as discipline that we need. And he goes on to say in Hebrews 12, he says, no discipline is pleasant at the time, but later it yields peaceable fruit of righteousness.
All right, we got to talk about this, David. So now you're telling me that Jesus has me in the valley?
I am.
You know, we go from chapter 4 in Hebrews, where we're given this wonderful picture then in verse 14, Hebrews chapter 4:14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace and help in the time of need. We have this picture then of why we should be comfortable and confident, bold even, to bow in prayer and go before the throne of grace saying, I need some help here. You know, I'm dealing with these issues. What do I do? Give me some help and some direction. And with confidence, we can know that not only does the Lord hear those prayers, but is reaching out to help us in those issues. But then you got chapter 12. where we read about the discipline of the Lord. And on one hand, some want to spin that in a little bit of a negative way. But I'm not seeing it in that negative way. Why would he discipline us?
Well, he says in the context there, he disciplines us for our own good.
Okay.
But clearly, while it's happening, it is not pleasant.
Yeah.
But he said, I guess, in the modern version, if you've got your head on straight, you understand that this may be something that makes me sit up and take notice as to some things that need to change or be done.
So parents, have we ever said to our children or our grandchildren now, I know this is tough, but this is for your own good. Okay, right? And as children, we think, no, it ain't. And we have to understand that sometimes the Lord is going to use some of the most difficult circumstances of our life to teach us and to train us, to perfect us, to mature us. We have all of those.
David didn't, when he wrote the psalm, he didn't say, well, the Lord has promised me smooth sailing all the way.
And David never had smooth sailing, did he? Like that. Phil, then we'll come this way.
As we walk through this valley of the shadow of death, we have to remember that we're being transformed as a child
Okay.
of God.
Right.
So each trial that we encounter is going to make us stronger.
Well, don't you hope that every time we go through a deep valley that we can reach a higher mountain, on the other side? And maybe the next valley that comes along doesn't take us as deep as we have been before. I like to think of it that way, at least.
This idea that the valley can be almost like pleasant, like you were talking about in class, kind of been swimming around. And it's interesting because us as sheep, very narrow-sighted in the fact of, this is nice, there's water, there's grass, there's easy terrain. Why are we trying to face this great mountain and get out? But we trust in the shepherd of, he sees the bigger picture. He has the broader view of, yeah, but wait till we get over this mountain. Wait till we get to the top.
Right.
Like, you don't know what is in store.
Yeah.
Because we are so narrow-sighted.
Because there could be those times in the valley where we look around and we think, this is pretty good. Let's just stay here. But the shepherd is saying, no, you need to come on, follow me, come this way. Because the shepherd sees what we don't see. The dangers that we talked about earlier, okay? The shepherd might see those dangers. Well, we have to go through the valley because to get to the mountain, you have to go through the valley. But he's saying, come on, let's keep moving, let's keep going. Where we might be saying, well, let's just hang out here for a while. And the shepherd's saying, we have to keep going. Okay, good. I think that's a good point, too.
The context of Hebrews 12 is endurance. And in the beginning of the chapter, he says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Going back to what Alan brought up in Matthew, the author and perfecter of our faith. And then in verse 7, it is for discipline that you endure. So that's when he goes in and talks about the effect of struggling through sin and then taking months of life. Its effect on us is discipline.
Yeah.
And that's how we are to treat it. But the point I wanted to make is that endurance requires us to fix our eyes on Jesus.
And so, what does Jesus know about endurance?
Everything.
And so we are trusting in the one who is helping us to gain and learn this endurance, who understands something about that, who has faced the dark valleys. At the very beginning of his ministry, it is Satan himself who is tempting the Lord. I mean, that's how his ministry begins, remember? I mean, it starts out right there with Satan tempting Jesus. Does he know something about endurance? Yes, he did. He's proven to us what we need to do. All the way to the end of his ministry. Lord, let this cup pass, if it be your will. He knows something about endurance. He knows something about the valleys. And I think that's important for us to see. We've talked a lot about these valleys, but I think it's important In fact, I think it's kind of one of the key things that we have to pull out of this passage, the idea of that endurance and perseverance. Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5. And let's see, we'll begin at verse 1. Romans chapter 5 and verse 1. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have access by faith into this grace in which we stand and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who is given to us. Just touching again on the point, and then we'll just have to move on some, but touching again on the point that sometimes it's when we face the greatest trials, persecution, and tribulation that we grow the most. I mean, most of us can look back at some times in our lives, and some have had some very difficult periods of time to look back on, or we can look back and we can say, man, that was really bad. I don't want to have to go through that again. But in faith, we have come out stronger than we would have ever been if we had not faced those trials. And so I think, again, that's one of the hopes that we have. Knowing that we have a shepherd to walk with, who will help us, who will lead us. So we're going back to this dark valley again. We picture the valley of death. We think of it in a dark setting very often, just kind of a gloomy place. Must it be that way? Must we always think of that whenever we read this, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death? Do we have to have just a dark, gloomy view of that? I'm thinking no. I don't think it has to be in just that view. I think we can have some positive views that come out of that too. Right.
Then why would he say, I fear no evil?
Yeah.
I mean, it is gloomy. But it may not necessarily be death, but it's the world we live in.
Yes.
And I do think it's interesting that the first three verses is, he makes me, he leads me, he restores me, he guides me. And right here where it gets dark, I walk. And we've already touched on it. We're kind of getting off the beaten path. But then he turns around like, hey, you're here. Good. And that gets back to Peter.
Yeah.
Like, hey, there's my Lord out there.
Yeah.
Oh, look at all that. Oh, you're here. You're saved.
Yeah.
I mean, it's beautiful how it is, the pronouns.
Yes.
He lead, and then the rest, and we'll get to it.
Yep. I.
He comforts me. Well, yeah, and then he comforts me. So we're still the object of his love and care.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the pronouns here in the split between 3 and 4, but honestly, I mean, we sing the song Paradise Valley, so I get the point, but I don't know why I would fear no evil if it wasn't a dark and gloomy place.
It is.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think what lends light to the dark and gloomy is the Lord.
Yeah.
That's the light. Knowing that even when we are in the darkest of valleys, we have a light. We have a light that's going to see us through and help carry us through. Let's talk for a moment here about comfort when we're walking through the dark valley. And turning that to the question then, what is the comfort that we can find? What kind of comfort can we find when we're walking through the dark valley? We've touched on this some more. I just want to pull this out a little bit more. What is the comfort we can find when we're walking through the dark valley?
Each other.
Well, okay, might be each other. You know, bear each other's burdens. Lift each other up. Okay?
I think of Jesus.
Okay.
Just
Again.
sitting there talking to him.
Think about, throughout the Bible story, the encouragement that God gives over and over. A period of time that was a great transition for the children of Israel as they're about to enter into the promised land. Moses is no more. Their leader for 40 years. Moses is no more. And to Joshua and to the people, God said, be strong and courageous. And on one hand, people could have easily said, well, that's easy for you to say, Be strong and courageous, the Lord said. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua chapter 1. And 3 times he says right there in a short passage, or a short piece, be strong and courageous. God's loyalty, it's been mentioned already. You know, I will never leave you or forsake you, he says in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. Actually, it goes back to the Old Testament where that starts at. For sheep, what refreshment, what is refreshing about the valleys? We talked about this. Well, there's water there. There's fresh grass. There's fertile fields. Some of the best pastures may be there. But for us, turning this around, what can we hope for? What sense of refreshing or restoration can we find coming from the deep valleys of life?
In John 16, it talks about that in me you may have peace. So when you think of a valley, it's
Okay.
peaceful.
Okay, all right.
That's what you're looking for.
Well, there can be some peace. Let's go with that. I want to develop this little idea. What sense of refreshing or restoration might we find after the deep valleys of life?
Even though there's life beyond this, you know, we have eternal life.
Okay, in the big picture, whatever dark valley we have to face here in life, in the big picture when this life is over, okay, that's a sense of refreshing. Yeah.
Well, the verse says, verse 4 says that it's your rod and your staff that comfort me. So how does that work? I mean, what is it about the rod and the staff?
Oh,
that comfort?
well, when we get to lesson 9, we will talk about that on Sunday. But you're right. That is the connection. Okay, that is the connection as we come out of the dark valley. The comfort that he finds by God's rod and staff. Like, how does that bring comfort? That's the good question. That's where we'll head with that. I want to kind of make sure we have this idea here, you know, that there is a sense of refreshing and restoration when we come out of that deep valley. And the hope of that comes through the shepherd. Okay? Brad.
Well, that's, sometimes it's, we can't articulate it, and if anybody has had a family member or been touched by suicide, that's the difference.
Yeah.
That individual was in that deep
Yeah.
valley with no hope,
Yeah.
with no sense of comfort.
Right.
Whereas others might have been in the same situation, but
But responded differently.
and that, they got a refreshing. They got some kind of restoration, and they pulled through it. So, I mean, this is very, real.
Yeah, it is real.
Some people, that's the difference. There is no hope. And they're
Okay.
stuck in that valley.
And let's work that for just a minute right here, because I think this is an interesting point. You know, some people in life face great challenges and difficulties and can never seem to get out of the dark valley. And I mean, we're not being critical of anybody about this. We're just saying, hey, here's a reality. And how can we and how should we be different than that? Because listen, understand, there are people in this life, when you talk to them, like you realize, it's like, man, they have no hope. They have nowhere to look. They see nothing. They see nothing that is going to help them out of this dark funk that they are in.
When you hear people say they haven't put their faith in God, is that true, or are they just at a point where they don't know how to get out of it, like Brad was saying? I really hate to hear people say that, because unless you experience it, you wouldn't know. I don't know.
So there's a couple of sides to this here, and some I don't think we'll be able to really kind of work through tonight. You know, can some people get to such a mental state
Right.
that truly they can't see any way out, and make rash choices and decisions? Yes, I think that happens. There's proof. I think we see where that happens. Could that happen to us? Well, it could. You know, sometimes people say in a rather, very plain way, well, if you have more faith, you'll be okay. Well, to someone who is at the very bottom, maybe someone even who doesn't even understand faith, someone who does not understand that we can have a shepherd that leads us through life, well, that doesn't really mean a whole lot to them. Say, we need greater faith. That doesn't compute. That doesn't help. I'm sorry, but I'm afraid that's not helpful for us to say that. You know, I mean, there's perhaps some other help that they are needing to help them get to a different place. You know, I responded to a lot of car wrecks back in the day, you know, the fire department days and stuff like that. And you find somebody laying on the road and their leg is bent around backwards the way it's not supposed to be. I never one time said, well, you know, let's pray together and you'll feel better. Or if you had greater faith, you won't feel this. That's not what they're needing at that moment. There's another response that may be necessary. But in this bigger picture, how can we, you know, get through these valleys, dark valleys of life, and come out on the other side, even feeling refreshed, having been through the darkest time of our life? The difference is having that shepherd who is going to lead us through and carry us to the other side. That's the difference we can have.
Paul's way of phrasing it in Romans 8 is, if God is for us, who can be against us?
Right. Right.
But again, if a person is in the depths of despair, clinical depression,
Yeah.
the-
Can't see it.
you can't, some trite saying is not going to solve it.
No, that's right. That's
But
right.
if they can come eventually to the realization that if God is on their side,
Yeah.
nothing else.
That there is a better way, and here's the instructions for a better way.
And for those of us who have or see that shepherd, even when we're down, I mean, that, when Jesus was gonna heal his daughter, I think it was like, if you believe, you know what he said? He said, Lord, help my unbelief.
Right.
It's not wrong for us to pray to God
Yeah.
in those times of doubt and go,
Yeah.
help my doubt.
Yes.
Help my unbelief.
That's right.
Satan's working on
In
it.
fact, that is the right prayer.
Exactly.
That is the prayer that we should
We
have.
shouldn't be ashamed of it. Now,
You know.
I don't know if we just do it in our public, like in the service, but maybe, but that's what the Lord wants.
You know, I can appreciate so much when we've had those occasions where somebody comes forward saying, I just need you all to pray for me. And in fact, I wish sometimes we were more bold and we did that more often, really. You know, because there are those times where we just, you know what, we just need some prayers right now. You know, to help us get focused, to help us through that valley so we can see the other side. Maybe so we can be reminded of the shepherd that's going to help us get through. We need to remember that. Okay, Janie and then Susan.
If we had someone we can go to, so a close friend in the church, whatever, and know that it's gonna stay with them, that you can talk to.
That can be helpful.
That's the best.
That can be very, very helpful. Susan?
One of the things that means the most to me is that Jesus never criticized people when he met them for their sin. He met them where they were.
Where they were.
And that's what we need to do, is just, if they're down, they're
You know what?
down.
You can't pull anybody out of the valley when you're up on the top of the mountain and saying, why don't you just come up here?
Right.
Sometimes we're going to have to go to the valley to help them work their way out. And that's what Jesus did.
Yes, and then I think of Elijah
Yeah.
and how, you know, God, we have to be quiet because God is in that small, still
Sure.
voice.
He's
And
there.
then he had him sleep,
Mm-hmm.
and he had him eat.
Good discussion tonight. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoyed the class.